You open your eyes, stretch, and get out of bed. Another beautiful day in the land of the free, the good old US of A. You turn on the TV to see how your favorite, the Toronto Maple Leafs, did at last night's match. Walk out into the nippy 10-degree Fahrenheit weather to grab a coffee at Tim Hortons, and you wave to your neighbor when he says, "Brisk out here, eh?" Wait, what's happening? Are you even in the US? Well, it turns out you are, but in the state called Canada. We don't know how it happened, but we're curious to see what would life actually be like if Canada became the 51st US state. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we are going to find out. The first issue to bring up with Canada as a state is that, well, Canada is huge. No, seriously, it is really massive. We're talking bigger than the entire US. So we would have one US state that would have a larger landmass than the rest of the country, making it, well, hard to govern, to say the least. In fact, with Canada in the mix, America would automatically become the largest country in the world, surpassing even Russia. The US would balloon up to 7.65 million square miles, covering 80% of the North American continent. The combined countries would cover 3.8% of the Earth, making the new US a pretty formidable power. This would also include the military strength of the US, as presumably approximately 100,000 members of the Canadian Army would now be a part of the US military. Then there's the 66 fighter jets, 145 helicopters, 12 Navy frigates, and 4 submarines that would also come under US control, bolstering its military forces. Perhaps the most interesting US security change would be in the Arctic, an area of interest for many world powers right now. As polar ice melts and new shipping lanes open up at a higher and higher latitude, countries are eyeing land further north than usual. And Canada, after all, is nicknamed the Great White North. 40% of its landmass and 75% of its coastline is in the Arctic. This part of Canada is home to the Inuit people, sub-zero temperatures, ice road truckers, and a vast amount of natural resources. The US suddenly having access to the Arctic would put it at a great advantage internationally. In addition to the new shipping lanes, the US would now have domestic access to huge fisheries, oil and gas reserves, and minerals and metals like diamonds, gold, silver, lead, and zinc. And that's not even including the arguably most important resource the US would have access to in an increasingly warm and more drought-prone world: water. With Canada as the 51st state, the US would have immediate access to the largest freshwater reserves on the planet. This would stabilize the country's reliance on freshwater at a time when global supplies are increasingly in danger. Canada has 20% of the global freshwater ready supply. The US has more renewable freshwater resources, ranking number 3 in the world, but Canada still ranks 4th. With Canada as a state, the US would now count 1,433 cubic miles of renewable freshwater within its borders. And speaking of resources the US would love, Canada also has over 10% of the world's known oil reserves. The US itself only has 2.1% of global oil reserves, so having Canada as a state would automatically boost America's oil reserves to 206 billion barrels. That would place it as the 3rd largest oil powerhouse in the world, trailing only behind Saudi Arabia with 267 billion barrels and Venezuela. So, how would the new surge in domestic oil supplies with Canada as the 51st state affect the US as a whole? Well, that's actually more complicated than you might think. The US, sans Canada, produces more oil than it consumes. Theoretically, the US is energy independent. But it's not that straightforward, as the US still imports 4 million barrels of oil a day from Canada, 70% of them processed by Midwest refineries. In fact, Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of energy to the US. But why? As it turns out, not all oil is created equal. The US produces shale oil, which is generally lighter in color and much less viscous, meaning it flows more like water than the heavy oil taken out of Canadian tar sands. The problem is the US shale oil revolution has shifted things in its domestic oil industry relatively recently. Initially, a lot of domestic oil was coming from regions like California, one of the few places within the US that does produce black, goopy crude that's like that of Canada's. And that means that US refineries are, by and large, set up for processing thick crude oil. They have to export their own lighter oil to other refineries around the world. Now, the US could change the way its refineries work, but that won't happen overnight. It takes a long time and a lot of money to redo almost the entire refinery industry for lighter oil. In the meantime, the US actually makes more money from importing Canada's cheap oil. Heavy oil tends to be cheaper, and then selling light, expensive oil overseas. So it has no incentive to change things right now. If Canada was a US state, the heavy Canadian oil would flow into the southern US states more easily. That might make prices at the pump drop as well, as the US would have easy access to now domestic, thick crude oil. It might also lessen potential U.S. dependency on two less friendly nations, Russia and Venezuela, the two other largest producers of heavy oil. If Canadian oil is secured as a domestic product, the U.S. wouldn't need to worry about ever having to rely on two unallied nations to keep their refineries productive and busy. This brings us to another notable aspect of Canada. Many Americans already think of Canada as basically just America, with more politeness, hockey, and maple syrup. Oh, and a universal healthcare system. So what would happen to that system with Canada as the 51st state? Well, there are a handful of existing U.S. states, especially in the Northeast, that come close to universal coverage within their state. Massachusetts, for example, has lowered the percentage of uninsured within the state to 2.4%, but they still don't provide low-cost to free coverage like Canada. Perhaps Canada would be allowed to keep its healthcare system within state borders, reflective of state-to-state differences in the U.S. today. However, their healthcare has also been increasingly burdened as of late, and it is possible that being within the U.S. would break that system completely. Because if one U.S. state suddenly had free or near-free healthcare, people from all over the rest of the country might start pouring into Canada to get their treatment there. Wait times have already become a big issue for certain health services in Canada, so an influx of even more people hoping for low-cost healthcare would increase those times by a lot. It's likely Canada would have to restrict universal healthcare coverage to only those citizens with a residence within its borders. The alternative is that Canada switches to a more privatized healthcare system, like the US. That would mean increasing costs for locals hitting their wallets hard. And let's be real, that wouldn't sit well with many Canadians. In fact, it could fuel serious resentment toward Washington, D.C., and even intensify calls for independence from some provinces. The idea of not all of Canada being the 51st state is even more likely when we consider the other big problem with this model: governing its people. See, one of the problems with Canadian statehood is that Canadians don't want it. A study by the Angus Reid Institute found that 90% of Canadians oppose becoming a part of the U.S. The oil-rich provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan may want to go their own way, but they would provide a massive benefit to the U.S. because of their resources. So, it's very possible the U.S. would bend over backwards to accommodate what those provinces want and favor the populations there to keep Canada as an intact 51st state. This brings us to the economy and the implications for both the U.S. as a country and Canada as a 51st state. The possibilities are endless, but so far economists have identified certain pros and certain cons. First, a likely positive development: the movement of goods between the U.S. and Canada would increase even more than the already high volume between the two entities. In 2022, $909 billion in goods moved back and forth between the two countries. Though the U.S. and Canada currently have a free trade agreement, something Canada hasn't achieved within its own country, and we'll get back to that soon, moving goods between borders still requires inspections, permits, and other paperwork. Canada, being the 51st state, would completely remove that international border, speeding up and likely increasing the movement of goods between the U.S. and Canada. On a larger scale, Professor Trevor Tomby, an economics professor at the University of Calgary, believes that Canada being a state would boost its economy in some ways. He explains that the bigger the market, the more competitive the market, the better the outcome for the economy overall, for consumers, for productivity, and for growth. Also, the current interprovince model in Canada actually has less regulatory oversight by the Canadian government than some interstate commerce in the U.S. does. If the Canadian provinces adopted an interstate model, or just became part of a huge state, it would ease challenges to commerce that currently exist between the different Canadian regions. Each Canadian province has its own regulations for governing things like the hours truckers are allowed to drive and the tires they require, for example. Since these rules are different from one province to the next, they create some friction in the interstate movement of goods. Using a 2016 model, Tomby believed this would reduce the potential of the Canadian economy by 3 to 7% every year. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business, CFIB, found that Canada's internal protectionism costs around $200 billion in annual economic activity, something that Canada could recoup as a U.S. state. But Tomby also recognizes that it wouldn't be all roses. Generally, Canada has more small to medium-sized businesses than the U.S., which is dominated by large corporations, and the elimination of trade barriers wouldn't just apply within Canada, but between the U.S. and Canada as well. Tomby believes that this would likely lead to the closure of many small Canadian companies, as Canadian borders keep investments within the country to a certain extent. This means small companies would be unable to withstand direct competition from massive corporations. The latter could undercut small companies by lowering prices, using legal teams at their disposal, and other tactics similar to the whole Walmart model of driving smaller independently owned shops out of business. This would lead to higher unemployment in Canada and a decrease in the number of Canadian entrepreneurs and business owners. So, while Canada's internal commerce would operate with fewer barriers, the news isn't as good for Canadian businesses, leading to mixed economic outcomes. The US, on the other hand, would probably see more of a benefit after being able to replace a lot of Canadian companies and opening up their domestic market to an extra 40 million consumers, a 12% increase in their domestic customer base. Associate Professor and Chair in International Trade, Werner Antweiler, who works at the University of British Columbia, raises another important issue: the dollar. If Canada adopted the US dollar, the stronger American currency would be a double-edged sword. While it would benefit the Canadian import market, but hurt Canada's exports toward the rest of the world, as they would become less competitive. Once again, this would likely benefit the US as a whole. More Canadian-made items would likely stay within the US, since selling domestically in the same currency would be more practical than exporting abroad. And Canada would be left more vulnerable to global shocks that affected its specific economic strengths, particularly energy. Its interest rates and other monetary policy would now be determined by the Fed rather than the Bank of Canada, and the Fed would be setting policy, taking the entire US into account, not just the economy of the Canadian state. But since we're talking about the economy, let's get to the most important thing, the thing people care the most about: income. Take-home income would be impacted in both positive and negative ways. Economist Jim Stanford points out that the 2022 current median after-tax income in the US was around $74,500, while the Canadian median after-tax income was $70,500 Canadian, or just over $49,000 US dollars. However, Stanford also points out that the differing incomes are a bit deceiving, and the median Canadian may actually be better off. This is because healthcare, childcare, and other services are taken care of, decreasing the personal expenses needed after taxes. As he summarized it, some people would say, "Oh, we'll get lower taxes, but we'll get lower services for the taxes." For example, in 2022, single-person healthcare coverage cost the average U.S. citizen about $7,900 per year. That alone takes out a huge chunk of the US-Canada salary difference. And that's not even counting the extra out-of-pocket expenses most healthcare coverage in the US, outside of the best corporate policies, necessitates. But healthcare isn't the only thing where government policies and subsidies create a price, and therefore a cost of living difference. In 2022, the average cost of full-time daycare in Canada for children ages 0 to 3 was around $8,100 Canadian or $5,700 US per year. But Child Care Aware of America found that the average annual cost of full-time daycare across the US for infants is just over $14,000, based on 2023 numbers, a fact that may have just decreased your sperm and/or egg count. Also, housing in Canada is expensive and getting pricier, but still not at US prices. The average rent for an apartment in the entire US is $1,700. States like California, Massachusetts, and New York are over $2,500 a month statewide, and frequently over $3,000 per month in metro areas. On the other hand, the average rent across Canada is $2,100 Canadian, which translates to around $1,500 US. So while it's likely Canadian wages would get a boost by being the 51st US state, so would Canadian living expenses, and if their public benefits were exchanged for the privatized versions available in the US, their standard of living may not change very much at all. It might even worsen for the less well-off Canadians, as the current poverty rate in Canada is 9.9%. Meanwhile, the US poverty rate stands at 11.1%. Canada has less income inequality than the US, but that could change if it became the 51st state. Joining the US market would likely favor high earners, who could thrive in a more competitive economy. Meanwhile, lower-wage workers would take the biggest hit, facing tougher job competition and fewer social benefits across the board. The US, on the other hand, would overall see a giant economic boost, as its economy, with Canada as a state, would surpass $30 trillion. This would put it comfortably ahead of China's $17.79 trillion GDP. Then there's the most important change Canada would bring as the 51st state. It would completely disrupt the current US political system and balance, perhaps changing the US's party system forever. Canada bringing oil, water, and minerals into the mix is also going to give it a lot of negotiating power within the country. It would take on an outsized and more vocal role compared to most other states. This could create tension with financial heavyweights like California and Texas, who are used to dominating U.S. politics. And that's because Canada would immediately become the most populous state in the Union. With just over 40 million people within its borders, the most populous U.S. state, California, has just under 39 million. Canada would also be the third largest economy of any U.S. state after California and Texas, with a GDP of $2.14 trillion. Theoretically, 2 senators would represent all of Canada's landmass if the rules that applied to every other state were followed. But would Canada actually remain intact as one state, at least in any peaceful way? Canada, like the U.S., is subdivided into smaller regions. They just call theirs provinces instead of states. And each province, once again like the U.S., has a distinct identity that it's more or less protective of. Quebec, for example, would fall on the more side. And if you think Texas bucks federal rule, just wait till you deal with Quebec. Contrary to the stereotype of polite, passive Canadians and independent, freedom-loving Americans, the reality is surprising. Canadian provinces actually have far more autonomy than the average U.S. state, giving them greater control over their own policies. Each province has a big say in its own healthcare, policing, education, and so on, much more so than the average U.S. state. Quebec never even ratified the Canadian Constitution, and each province is also allowed to opt out of constitutional guarantees. That means that if Canada were admitted as a state, either the entire region or distinct provinces may want to keep this power of opting out of the national constitution. It's not really going to fly in U.S. politics, where the Constitution is considered much more sacred for national law. Provincial independence also leaves a big possibility that Canada might be divided into 10 different states to reflect its current provinces. Politically, that would mean an extra 20 senators in Congress. This may set off a renewed independence movement within Quebec, which is honestly always flirting with one to begin with. Recent polling shows that the province's separatist party, Parti Québécois, has a big lead with 34% support as opposed to 25% for the second most popular party. Not only does the province have its own identity, but also its own language, as the majority of Québécois are French speakers, and French is the only official language of the province. It's unlikely Quebec would be encouraged to maintain a sole official language contrary to the majority language of the U.S., but even if it was, Quebec might see this political merging as a chance to leave Canada turned to the U.S. altogether. And if it weren't allowed to leave the U.S., it may encourage the resurgence of violent separatist groups that existed in the 60s and 70s, like the Front de Libération du Québec. The U.S. would have an active separatist movement inclined to kidnap politicians and bomb public buildings on its hands. There is another world where the U.S. may try to ease separatist tensions by accepting Quebec's separate official language, which would encourage other U.S. states to declare other official languages as well. Many states have significant Spanish-speaking, mostly in the South and Southwest, and French-speaking minorities, primarily in the North, that may follow Quebec's example. Either way, it's likely that a Quebec province already trending toward independence might try to leave, peacefully or not, from the new USA. And that's just Quebec. Canada also has other provinces bristling at centralized rule, most notably the oil-rich provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. But let's say Canada only got 2 senators, like everyone else. Who would those senators be, and how would they affect U.S. politics? Well, we can't know exactly who, but we do know it probably wouldn't be good news for Republicans. On average, Canadians tend to be more left-leaning and liberal on issues than the average American, though of course their opinions still exist all over the political spectrum. Politically, having Canada as a 51st state of the Union would basically be like attaching a second California, according to Politico, a highly populated, liberal-leaning state. An extra 2 Democratic senators would narrow Republicans' current lead in Congress, and then how many representatives would enter the lower house of Congress. It's likely, though not certain, that the House of Representatives would have to keep the same cap on the number of representatives, 435. Politico believes Canada would be given 45 seats, the number derived from California's representatives, as the similarly populated state now has 46 representatives. For that to happen, representatives would need to be taken from a whole bunch of other states, specifically 31 in total. California would lose the most, 6, Texas would lose 4, Florida 3, then New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina would each lose 2. A further 24 states, many of them Republican, would each lose 1 seat. Once again, with the exception of California, this reassignment would almost certainly favor Democrats overall, but it would also depend on which districts the representatives are reassigned from. After all, deep blue states have red pockets, and vice versa. All of this moving around of reps would also affect future elections, as Canada would suddenly find itself with 47 electoral votes, meaning that Democrats would need to win significantly fewer battleground states to clinch the presidential victory. That's because either party needs 271 electoral votes to win the presidency. With Canada added as a state, it would mean that a Democratic nominee would only need 18 electoral votes from battleground states to secure the win, translating to a minimum of 2 states. Republicans, on the other hand, would need to win 5 battleground states. It wouldn't guarantee a victory for the Democrats, but it would make Republicans' road to the presidency a bit tougher than it has been so far. And that's not even considering the fact that with Canada as a 51st state, the Democrats and the Republicans may not be the only parties in play anymore. Canada has 5 different political parties at the federal level, and many more scattered amongst its provinces. Given its weight, it's likely Canada would push for at least one of its political parties to enter the U.S. system, shaking up the balance of power in Washington. Considering the resistance many Canadians have to U.S. rule, it's probable that many of them would vote for a homegrown party within the U.S. government. Given the population of Canada, this would affect representation in Congress, making the U.S. a true multi-party system, not one in name only as it mostly is these days. What do you think would happen if Canada was the 51st state? Let us know in the comments. In the meantime, check out the United States versus Canada. Who would win? Army-military comparison, or this other one right here?